Morning, all. All right, so I'm starting off by taking a look at the Florida Panthers today. They were, of course, eliminated last night, the final team eliminated from the 2023 Stanley Cup playoffs. Being a finalist means I will do a video for them as finalists and add it to the finalist playlist. But the Florida Panthers, of course, going 42, 32, and 8 this season. They were the number 2 wild card in the East, coming off of a great year last year that fizzled in the playoffs. This year, they had kind of a fizzling season until late in it, and then they made the playoffs. And then they had a great run. And it didn't look great to start. So they lose the first game in Boston 3-1. They win the next game in Boston 6-3, which started a long road winning streak. We had no idea that that was going to happen because games 3 and 4 at home, they lost both, 4-2 and 6-2 respectively. That 6-2 win, it looked like, all right, so Boston, all they have to do is win one of the next 3. They should be good for that. However, Florida said no. First game that they win to start the comeback was a 4-3 overtime win over Boston in Boston. They went home, they won a sloppy 1-7-5, and then they go back into Boston and they win in overtime 4-3. So games 5 and 7 in Boston, they win both of them in overtime. It started what was really quite the story for them in overtime. So they move on to the second round and they play Toronto. And again, underdogs against the Toronto Maple Leafs, right? So they won both games in Toronto to continue that winning streak on the road, 4-2 and 3-2. Then they come home, they win in overtime, 3-2. So their overtime record was perfect. And then they lose game 4 at home, 2-1. They were not as good at home in these playoffs as they were on the road. And then they go to Toronto and they win in overtime, 3-2. So that's 2 straight series that they win on the road in overtime to punch their ticket to the following round, where they would meet Carolina this time around. And Carolina, a team that apparently just isn't allowed to win in conference finals. 3-2 4 overtime victory in game 1 sets the table. Then there's a 2-1 overtime win in game 2. Both of those in Carolina, of course. And then they go home, they win 1-0 and 4-3. So for the Florida Panthers, they pulled off 3 of the bigger upsets in NHL's history. I would say this is one of the most impressive runs by a Stanley Cup finalist that I've watched. And then they go on to the final against Vegas. The thing is, Vegas, totally different beast. Vegas, a team that can skate as fast as Florida. They can play the physical game. And some of the tactics that Florida was using to wear down Boston, Toronto, and then Carolina just didn't work against Vegas. And it was right out of the gate. Vegas wins the first game 5-2. That was tied at 2 going into the third. And then the second game was a blowout win 7-2 for the Vegas Golden Knights. Game 3 at home, they win in overtime 3-2. So overtime is still the friend of the Florida Panthers in the playoffs. They lost the fourth game 3-2. That was really close. They just could not get that tying goal. And then, of course, last night in Las Vegas, a 9-3 win for the Vegas Golden Knights, as they just weren't going to be denied. There was nothing Florida could do to answer that ridiculous amount of offense from the Vegas Golden Knights. And so for Florida, the clock strikes midnight, as it usually does for the Cinderella runs. So Matthew Tkachuk's an interesting one to look at. So since the Stanley Cup final came to an end, we have found out he was playing with a fractured sternum, which was painful enough and hard enough to move around that he needed help getting dressed before Game 4. Could not dress himself, could not get the equipment on, the jersey and all that, and so he needed help with that. This is obviously an injury that you normally would not play through, and there were numerous players on this team, we'll come back to it, who were playing through things that players normally would take time off for. So Tkachuk's first round, he had 5 goals, 6 assists for 11 points in 7 games against Boston. Against Toronto, he didn't have a goal. He only had the 5 assists in 5 games, but he was a really valuable player in that series against Toronto. And then in Carolina, the goal scoring returns, 4 goals and an assist for 5 points in 4 games, before in the final, recording 2 goals and an assist for 3 points in 4 games. So he didn't play last night. That was a big hole in the lineup for Florida to try to fill up. And obviously, his stats not necessarily being as strong against Vegas as they were against Carolina, well, having a fractured sternum would do that. And then you look at Sasha Barkov. There's been a lot of talk I've seen from people about Sasha Barkov's play. I understand it, but with Barkov, he is seen as an underrated forward because his defensive game is fantastic. Well, in the first round against Boston, a goal and 5 assists for 6 points in 7 games. Against Toronto, a goal and 2 assists for 3 points in 5 games. Against Carolina, 2 goals, 3 assists, 5 points in 4 games. Had a tougher time against Vegas, 1 goal, 1 assist, 2 points in 5 games. But most players in all 4 rounds against the Vegas Golden Knights had a tough time of it. And then you get to Bobrovsky. Bobrovsky really is the story of these playoffs for Florida. and it was the best and worst of times for him. So in the first round against Boston, he's 3-1. But he wasn't great against Boston. 891 save percentage. So it was one of those things where, as a Bruins fan, I was kind of frustrated because at times he looked pedestrian against Boston, and others he looked great. And so it was tough, right, for me again as a Bruins fan. But then against Toronto, he really hits his stride. 4-1 with a 943 save percentage. Yeah, he steals some games against Toronto there. And then against Carolina, well, the theft is his now. 4-0 in that series, 966 save percentage. So Bobrovsky, an absolutely remarkable run, but Vegas had some of the most accurate shooting I think I've ever seen in the playoffs. I may have to do a video on that as well. Just look through Stanley Cup winners and say, okay, how accurate were these teams? Against Vegas, the numbers for Bobrovsky take quite the hit. He ends up being 1-4 with an 844 save percentage against the Vegas Golden Knights. And that is a big part of how Vegas ends up knocking out Florida, knocking themselves out. Anyways, the UFA and RFA list is not that long, really, when you look at the Florida Panthers, and there isn't really anybody here they can't re-sign. For instance, on the restricted free agent side, you've got Giovanni Smith, and you've got Colin White. Well, if they want to keep those, I'm sure they'll be able to afford them. On the UFA side, there's Eric Stahl. The question of whether or not he might retire is going to be out there, of course. Radko Gudas, who is playing through injury. Mark Stahl. If they want to bring him back, I would think they'd be able to find a way to do it. Again, depending on whether or not players retire or whether or not all three Stahl brothers want to play together in Carolina. That might be a possibility as well. Alex Lyon, Patrick Hornquist, also on the UFA list. Hornquist probably going to retire, I would think. If they want to keep Lyon around, there's a question mark, though, because you have Spencer Knight. Spencer Knight is one of those question marks. So $4.5 million is the cap hit for Knight until 2026, when he's still a restricted free agent as well. But that $4.5 million cap hit is, he's in the player assistance program, and it's one of those things where you ask yourself, okay, how long is he going to be in that? When he comes back, what can we expect? And Knight had kind of an up and down season going. So the hope, of course, if you're a Florida fan, would be comes out of the assistance program and plays really, really well next year. But with Spencer Knight at $4.5 million, Bobrovsky at $10 million until 2026, will they try to gauge the market for Bobrovsky? There's been rumors about them looking to get rid of Bobrovsky's contract for at least 2 years now. And maybe after a run to the final, maybe somebody will pick up the phone. I think, honestly, that contract is largely immovable until next summer, but we'll see what happens. So their cap space going into next year, currently, according to Cap Friendly, $10,262,499. That will get eaten into quickly if they decide to bring back Gudas, and I think they should. So you have Bobrovsky at $10 million. You have Barkov at a $10 million cap hit until 2030. So anybody who says, well, Barkov didn't show up and they should ship him out, that contract's not that easy to move. And then you've got Matthew Tkachuk at $9.5 million per year until 2030 as well. So that's $29.5 million in cap space to Bobrovsky, Barkov, and Tkachuk. And all three of them are up here, of course, all three of them being key parts of that run to the Stanley Cup final. So they don't have a first or a third round pick in 2023. It's not a lot of draft picks for Florida, but we knew that, right? Florida kind of went all in last year, and of course this year trying to get into the playoffs and all that. Their upcoming prospect list is not great either. They've got a couple that maybe, right? So you've got Mackie Samoskevich, or Samoskevich, or Samoskevich, either way. But he's a number 24 pick from 2021, and maybe he ends up getting himself into the lineup. And then there's Justin Surdiff as well, who may very well end up pushing towards a job, but probably would need some time in the AHL first. There's not a lot there in terms of young players who could come up and play for them and really make that difference, which will start to happen as this team is better and they're trading away first-round picks. And so that's how that's going to happen. Good news for Florida fans is you've got 4 straight seasons of playoff appearances. Now they've got a President's Trophy win. They have got a Stanley Cup final appearance. And now it really is a matter of taking that momentum and keeping it going. So both on the ice and off the ice. So Florida's attendance has gotten better, right? The attendance got better during the season, and through the playoffs, it was through the roof. Now they need to keep that up. So one thing that will be kind of a pressure on Bill Zito is taking whatever lightning in a bottle this team had this year and finding a way to make that translate into next season as well, and making changes where need be. And then you're also going to have the potential for some injuries getting into next year. So they had 2 straight seasons, or they've had 2 straight seasons now of getting out of the first round, which is a franchise record as well. 1996, they get out of the first round last year and this year, and that's it. They don't get out of the first round outside of those opportunities. So Tkachuk has the fractured sternum. That sounds painful and time-consuming to come back from. Ekblad apparently playing on a broken foot. He also had a shoulder problem and an oblique. So that's a lot of injuries. Gudas had a high ankle sprain he was playing through. Reinhart and Montour both playing through injuries which have not yet been disclosed as to what they are. But some players are going to require surgery, according to Paul Maurice, which may cause them to miss time to start next season. Now, the one example I would use is Boston. Remember coming into this season, Boston, and myself too, I was right there saying, with these are going to be key players that are going to be out for Boston. That's going to have a really bad negative impact potentially on them coming out of the gate. And then Boston was fantastic without those core players, right? So there's the possibility that the Panthers rally around the fact that these key guys are out and they go out there and do their absolute best. And there could be players that are not on this list who end up having surgery as well. Certainly, it has been pretty obvious these playoffs were brutal to both Florida and Vegas, and I would expect both teams to have some injuries that linger into next season. And this is part of that storyline that I've talked about where, it is really hard to repeat. It is really hard to do this year after year after year because these injuries add up, right? There's injuries that are going to shorten careers that take place during the playoffs that guys play through, right? You're going to play those games like Tkachuk that you probably shouldn't, but it's the Stanley Cup final. You're not going to stay off the ice unless you absolutely can't go, which was the case with Tkachuk last night. So can Florida come back and do this again? And that's a valid question. I think they have the players that can do it. I think offensively they're excellent. Defensively they're good. And if Bobrovsky can figure this out and keep playing like he did in the playoffs, I think they have a very good shot at this. They should at the very least be a playoff team next year, but the Atlantic is going to be really tough. And with some key guys potentially out of the lineup to start the season, I think it's very unpredictable, which makes some sense because Florida was very unpredictable throughout the playoffs. So let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.